Hello, my name is Dr. David Kelly-Jones and I'm a lecturer in the Department of History and Welsh History at Aberystwyth University. In this lecture, I want to talk about Christopher Columbus and the invention of the Atlantic world. The idea of these lectures, these mini lectures, is to give you a taste really of the sorts of modules that we teach here in Aberystwyth. And this lecture is the first lecture in my option module for second and third year students called The Atlantic World 1492 to 1800. Christopher Columbus has traditionally been regarded as the person who discovered America. Every October, the United States celebrates Columbus Day. Just a couple of years ago, President Trump tweeted the following comment on Columbus Day 2018. Columbus' spirit of determination and adventure, he said, has provided inspiration to generations of Americans. And on Columbus Day, we honour his remarkable accomplishments as a navigator and celebrate his voyage into the unknown expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Columbus has held a remarkable sway over the history of America and also perhaps over popular imagination. For example, there are more statues in various places around the world to Christopher Columbus than anybody else in human history apart from Jesus Christ himself. But as you can see from these examples, Columbus evokes fairly extreme reactions. Admiration, depicted in the top left one, for example, as a classical Roman Caesar, to some of the other paintings where he is daubed with red paint to depict really the more problematic legacy of Columbus and the mass slaughter of the indigenous peoples of the Americas that resulted from Columbus's own arrival in America and the arrival of subsequent generations of Europeans as well. But Columbus, perhaps until more recent times, has tended to be depicted in pretty heroic terms. This is a famous painting by Salvador Dali on the discovery of America, painted in 1951, and here Columbus is depicted in these heroic terms. Columbus, there at the front of the picture, is depicted as an adolescent in sort of Greek Roman clothes as the bringer of civilization to the Americas. There's also an image of the Virgin Mary, of course, as monks with the crucifix, with him bringing Christianity to America as well. And the impression that Dali's painting is intended to convey is that the youthful Europeans are bringing good things to the Americas and that the best days of the Americas lie ahead because of Columbus's discovery. Whether that was the case or not, of course, has been much fought over by historians. So Columbus arrived in 1492 on the island that he named Hispaniola. Initially, he was welcomed enthusiastically by the indigenous peoples, the Taino people. They thought that he was a kind of godlike figure initially, and Columbus was fascinated by what he saw in the New World. Of course, Columbus, to his dying day, refused to admit that he had discovered a new continent. He had been sailing west in order to find a way to the east, and he maintained until his death that he had actually discovered the Japan. He had sailed to Japan and discovered a route to Asia rather than discovered America itself. Columbus, though, was the figure to open up the Americas as never before. He wasn't the discoverer of America, of course. We know that in the 12th century, a Viking explorer, Leif Erikson, had discovered to sail as far west as the Americas. And of course, any of you with a knowledge of Welsh history will know the myth of Maddog, 12th century prince from Gwynedd, Owen ab Maddog Gwynedd, who myth would have us believe discovered America in 1170. There's no evidence that that was true, although there is, of course, plenty of evidence to suggest that it was Leif Erikson who may have been the first European to set foot in the Americas. But the late 15th century was an incredibly propitious time for Columbus to sail across the Atlantic. It was the time, of course, of the Renaissance. There was within Europe a tremendous thirst for new knowledge, for discovering the world. And Columbus exemplified that in many, many respects. Europe was, particularly southern Europe, was emerging from a period of occupation by the Ottoman Empire. The King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella, Aragon and Castile had united their realm in the 1480s and had fought back the Islamic armies from the Iberian Peninsula. So they were keen to expand their influence, to find trading routes to the east that would circumvent the need to go to the west. So Columbus and the political realities of the late 15th century came together in an incredibly opportune way. Columbus, of course, benefited enormously from various technological improvements in navigation. That is the invention of tools like the astrolabe and the chronometer that allowed sailors to not only find where they were and chart accurately where they were in the world, but also to plot a route back in the same direction so that accurate routes to various locations could be easily repeated. Map making was also improving. There were much more accurate representations of the world that again allowed navigators, explorers to accurately chart where they were going. There were important innovations in terms of shipbuilding. Columbus famously sailed in the Santa Maria, a small caravel, highly manoeuvrable, small sails that were easily deployed so that once you got out into the ocean, you could sail much more quickly than had been the case previously. It enabled you to cover faster distances faster than had ever been the case before. So you could sail thousands of miles before running out of supplies on board the ship. So in all of these ways, the late 15th century was a really opportune moment for the discovery and for the westward expansion of Europeans. Columbus, of course, sailed to the Americas with the backing of Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492. It took him about 40 days to cross the Atlantic when he set foot on the island of Hispaniola. As I've said initially, he was fascinated by what he saw, by the new peoples that he discovered. But very, very quickly, he saw that these islands in what were the Caribbean, and be known to him, of course, were incredibly fertile in terms of their agriculture. And Columbus was determined to maximize the resources that he discovered on Hispaniola. He quickly enslaved the indigenous peoples, set them to work on plantations producing sugarcane, as had already been experimented with, the growth of which had already been experimented in the Azores and the Madeira Islands in the eastern Atlantic by the Portuguese and Spanish settlers in the middle decades of the 15th century. Columbus quickly turned over the island to this kind of agriculture, suppressing the indigenous peoples and reducing them to the level of slaves. And this set the pattern for the way in which Europeans would treat both the Americas and the indigenous American peoples. Columbus was a brutal colonizer. Once he faced any resistance to his rule, whether it was from Spanish settlers who came in a number of waves to the island after Columbus's landing, or from the indigenous peoples themselves, was met by a fairly brutal regime of repression. And many, many tens of thousands of the Taino people were lost their lives in the decades after Columbus's discovery, some of which was the result of the brutal treatment by the indigenous peoples. But, of course, the other reason for this was the introduction of European disease, particularly smallpox, that saw the wiping out of large numbers, tens of thousands of the Taino people, a pattern that was replicated in many of the other parts of Americas that Europeans arrived in the early part of the 16th century. But the arrival of Europeans in the Americas brought about enormous change to the Americas themselves as wave upon wave of European migrants arrived in the Americas, but also profound changes to Europe itself. Particularly, it inspired a sense of imperial expansion, as first the Spanish, Portuguese extended their influence in the Americas, and then as other countries wanted to rival Spanish power in particular, first the French, then the Dutch, then in the 17th century the English also began to acquire imperial possessions in the Americas. And the early modern period then can be viewed as the age of empire, the age of European expansion in various parts of the world. And historians have, in the last 20 years or so, begun to approach this whole subject in a very different way. The discipline of Atlantic history has become popular in many universities. Many universities teach courses on the Atlantic world in the early modern period, and here in Aberystwyth you would have plenty of opportunity to study such modules. And the basic assumptions of Atlantic history are that the discovery of the Americas at the end of the 15th century brought the peoples of 4 continents, Africa, Europe, North America, and South America, and the peoples who inhabited them, 3 races of people, Americans, Europeans, and Africans, into interaction with one another. The early modern period, of course, was the period before the creation and the establishment of the kind of nation states that we take for granted today, the European nation states, Britain, France, and so on. They were much more fluid in the early modern period. And so Atlantic historians say that rather than approaching the early modern period from the perspective of British history or French history, those kind of statist paradigms, if you like, that we're often assumed to be the main ways in which history is packaged, Atlantic historians say that we should take the whole of the Atlantic Ocean as our primary unit of analysis. And having done so, that then enables us to see how peoples, irrespective of the nation that they came from, were brought into creative tension and creative interaction with one another. One of the real virtues of this approach then is that it allows us to study, perhaps in a way that other approaches don't, the indigenous American perspective on this history, and also, of course, the African perspective too. Forced African migration into the Americas ran at 11 to 12 million throughout the early modern period, the 15th, 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. And that history has been largely forgotten in much of our discussion about the expansion of the Americas, aside, of course, from when we discuss slavery. Atlantic historians try to integrate the African perspective and the indigenous Americans perspective and the European perspective into our study of the Americas by looking at a whole range of themes: trade, discovery, the encounters between the indigenous, the Africans, and the Europeans. How did they think about each other? How did they understand one another? Of course, Atlantic historians look at the Atlantic Ocean as a value-free entity in which new forms of identity were able to be forged before people ever arrived in the Americas itself. It was a zone of cultural exchange as Europeans and Africans brought cultural practices with them to the Atlantic Passage. They were renegotiated as a consequence and redeveloped and re-expressed in new ways in the Americas. The Atlantic then was a zone of cultural exchange. So, this module on the Atlantic world gives you the opportunity to study Columbus and his impact on the discovery of America, but more so on the creation of an Atlantic world.